Hello everyone, welcome to Astera Psych, and today's video is an extension of one of my videos from last week where I talked about cognitive functions and my proposed theory for their inherent feminine or masculine nature. So if you haven't seen that video, you're going to need to see that one to understand this one. Now, as I said in that video, what I'm talking about today is purely hypothetical. This isn't something that I treat as truth in regard to MBTI or functions or type in general. This is just something that I have had in my mind for a while and I'm proposing as a theory. So the thing we're going to be talking about today specifically is which of the types are the most masculine, which are the most feminine, and which types kind of stand out as being odd, weird, or unique due to the inherent masculine or feminine nature of their cognitive functions. Let's get into it. So I divide the types into masculine and feminine types in a few different ways, but the primary way I do it is by looking at their lead pair, which is their top two functions. These are going to be the functions that are most consistently used in most of the personality types. Now, I also talk about how masculine or feminine the stress pair can be, which is what I call the bottom two functions. But I think if we're looking at the usual representation of a specific type, like what we're going to see 80 to 90% of the time, we're going to be looking at the lead pair and how these two functions are a representation of an overall personality type. Another thing to remember is that when I'm talking about the idea of masculinity and femininity, as I mentioned in the first video, we're not talking about traditional masculinity and femininity. In fact, I prefer to use the terms yin and yang, as these are representative of the ideas of soft versus hard, aggressive versus non-aggressive, these types of things. Masculine and feminine are components of the yin and yang kind of philosophy and those kind of concepts, but they're not entirely what make it up. So remember that as I'm going through these types and talking about masculine and feminine. I'm not going to be exclusively talking about traditional masculinity and femininity. Let's start with the most feminine type in my system, and that's going to be the INFJ. Now, INFJs lead with introverted intuition, which is the most feminine of all the functions. It's going to be introverted, feminine, intuition, feminine, and then it's a perceiving function, so feminine. They're going to have auxiliary extroverted feeling, which is extroverted, masculine, feeling feminine, and then it's a judging function, so it's going to be another masculine. So this means introverted intuition is FFF, and then extroverted feeling is MFM. Now, I know this can be a lot to take in, and even as I say this to the camera here, it can be kind of confusing to remember some of these things. But INFJs have the most amount of feminine in their lead pair compared to any other type, except for the ENFJ, which has the same amount. The difference is that the INFJ leads with the most feminine function. They lead with introverted intuition, where ENFJs do not. They lead with extroverted feeling instead. So INFJs take the spot as the most feminine type because they lead with introverted intuition and they have a function that is also very feminine as their auxiliary function. So what is this going to mean for the INFJ as a personality type? Well, this means that because they're the most feminine type and they have the most amount of feminine natures in their kind of top pair, it means they're going to overall present themselves as relatively feminine. And remember, as I said, that doesn't mean feminine in the traditional sense. What this is going to mean is that INFJs are very rarely pushy people. They're not going to be the types of people who are very aggressive. They're not going to be kind of domineering usually. When you see this kind of nature or these kind of behaviors from INFJs, it's usually something that stands out from the norm. And that's what we're going to see with their extroverted feeling function. You might see the occasional spikes in masculinity, but these spikes are not representative of the overall type. And because they have such a natural feminine nature, it's going to stand out compared to their normal personality when they engage in these small spikes of masculine behavior. So now let's contrast the INFJ to one of the weird types when it comes to this theory, and that's going to be the INTJs and the ENTJs. And this might seem kind of weird, but the INTJs also lead with introverted intuition, the most feminine of functions. The difference between this type and the INFJ is that the INTJ has auxiliary or secondary extroverted thinking. And what really makes this interesting is that extroverted thinking is the most masculine of functions. So they lead with the most feminine of functions, and they have the most masculine of functions as their auxiliary function. The ENTJs is the opposite of this, where they lead with the most masculine of functions, and they have the secondary function as the most feminine function. So what does this mean for the INTJ, for example? Well, this means for the INTJ that they have a relatively balanced overall psyche in terms of their lead pair. So they're not going to be too feminine, they're not going to be too masculine. But what we will see is very drastic shifts in this type when they switch from introversion to extroversion. So when they switch from their introverted form of perception as their lead function, they're going to be very feminine, laid back, relaxed, natural, kind of state that they're in. And then they're going to switch to this very masculine and almost aggressive at times nature when they go into their outer world because of extroverted thinking. So this is going to be something that makes this type stand out compared to a lot of the other types because they're going to have very frequent kind of natural shifts between their personality. I think with INTJs, you can often see this in the fact that they're very quiet and reserved, but when they engage in the outer world, they tend to have this switch that turns on almost like confidence in them, where they go out and do the thing that they need to do in a very confident manner. So they switch between that very feminine, relaxed, laid-back nature, and then they engage in this very masculine, pushy, aggressive nature to achieve the things that they're trying to achieve. Now, ENTJs are kind of the opposite of this, where they're naturally in that state of kind of pushiness, aggressiveness, get it done, this type of thing, very masculine in and of itself. And then when they go inwards, when they go into their introverted perception, their introverted intuition, they switch to a more kind of feminine nature where they're observant and relaxed. And we often see this in the archetype of like the great general or leaders of the world who are very aggressive go-getters, but they also have the patience to listen and watch as other people say things that they need to say. Going back to the ENFJ, there are actually two types in this system of masculinity and femininity that are really interesting because their overall lead pair kind of preference for masculinity and femininity goes against their dominant function, and that's going to be the ENFJ and the ISTJ. So the ENFJ, as I mentioned earlier, has masculine, feminine, extroverted feeling, and then they have feminine, introverted intuition, which means that overall they have more femininity in their top pair compared to masculinity. The difference, though, is that their lead function extroverted feeling, has more masculinity in it than femininity. It's not balanced like we see with some of the other functions that are kind of balanced or have this preference for masculinity and femininity. So they have an overall psyche preference for femininity, but they lead with a function that is slightly more masculine than feminine. And what this means for this type in particular is that you're going to see that they're going to attempt to be feminine in most of their actions and behaviors, but their dominant function is usually going to go against that kind of natural tendency. And you're going to see these kind of spikes in masculinity. And these spikes in masculinity and pushiness are actually going to be relatively bothersome for this specific personality type if they haven't kind of come to terms with who they are as an individual and how they prefer to process information. So if you have someone who prefers to be laid back, relaxed, but they kind of naturally engage in these pushy behaviors at times, you can see that this can be an issue for them as individuals as they struggle to process this. The same can be said of the ISTJ that leads with introverted sensing, and they have secondary extroverted thinking. So they have introverted sensing, which is a feminine, feminine function, and they have secondary extroverted thinking, which is a very masculine function. Now, what this means is that this type has an overall preference for masculinity. It's 4-2, masculine to feminine. But because the more feminine function is in the lead function slot, we're going to see that they're occasionally going to have these kind of feminine behaviors that go against who they are as an individual and what they want in their actions. So you might see that when they try to be aggressive, for example, that they might kind of pull back and say, oh no, maybe I shouldn't do that. Or they might have those kind of indecisive moments where they want to do a more masculine behavior, but they find it troublesome because they have that kind of feminine pull from the introverted sensing function. Other types that stand out compared to the others are going to be the extroverted intuitive leads and the introverted thinking leads. So why do these two functions or the types associated with them as leads stand out compared to the others? Well, extroverted intuition is the only feminine extroverted function, while introverted thinking is the only masculine introverted function. So ENTPs and ENFPs are unique because they live in a more kind of feminine version of the extroverted world. They are very adaptable. They're very go with the flow when it comes to how they interact with things in the outer world. And despite the fact that they're engaging in this kind of masculine energy cycle where they're going to be going out and finding things and being proactive, they're doing it in a very feminine way in which they're very adaptable instead of pushy in how they go about doing these things. Introverted thinking is kind of the opposite of this, where they're going to be very feminine in their approach to information and how they kind of approach new situations. But once they get involved with them, you'll find that they can be kind of hard as a rock. They're going to be very masculine and stone-like, unmoving when it comes to their ideas and the things that are important to them. So this leads types like the INTP and the ISTP to be very unmoving when it comes to how they approach certain situations and new information. Speaking of introverted thinking, the INTP and the ISTP are the perfect two types to kind of explain how this system can manifest itself in how we think about types and the archetypes that we associate with certain types, and why there is a difference in the masculinity and femininity there. So imagine in your mind an INTP. What do most INTPs end up doing with their life, or what do we typically think of when we think of an INTP in terms of their professional life? What kind of person comes to mind? Now do the same with an ISTP. What kind of person comes to mind when you imagine an ISTP? When people imagine an INTP, the first thing that usually comes to mind is something along the lines of a scientist, a researcher, somebody who reads a lot. They like to consume information. When we think of an ISTP, on the other hand, the first thing that comes to mind is usually something along the lines of an engineer, someone who's very good with their hands. They're very mechanical. They're going to be very straightforward in how they approach situations. They're not afraid to get their hands dirty, essentially. In my opinion, this is a perfect example for the difference between masculinity and femininity between these two types. The ISTP is a slightly more masculine type than the INTP. They both lead with introverted thinking, so they're going to have the same dominant function, but the auxiliary function has a one masculine or feminine difference compared to the other. Extroverted sensing is a masculine, feminine function, whereas extroverted intuition is a masculine, feminine function. So INTPs are slightly more feminine than ISTPs, and we can see this in the archetypes of how we think about these specific personality types. I don't have time to talk about each of the 16 types individually, but if you want to hear what I have to say about each of the 16 types, I will link my blog post down in the description box below where I go over this same topic in more depth and detail than this video. That said, I'm going to finish up by talking about one more type, which is the most masculine of personality types, the ESTJ. And you might be telling yourself, well, the ENTJ also leads with extroverted thinking, so they're very masculine as well. And they are, but their auxiliary function is introverted intuition, which is the most feminine function, and this acts as a counterbalance to that extroverted thinking dominant function. The ESTJ, on the other hand, does not have a feminine counterbalance to the same degree that the ENTJ does. They lead with extroverted thinking, which is masculine, and they have secondary introverted sensing, which is feminine, feminine, which means they're going to have 4 masculine natures in their lead function pair, and they're going to lead with the most masculine function, extroverted thinking. This leads to a personality type that is going to be consistently masculine in their interaction styles, how they process information, how they communicate with others. They're going to be relatively pushy and aggressive. It's going to be hard to get them to move from their viewpoints in terms of how they're just kind of approaching information. They're going to be extremely go-get-it kind of people when it comes to how they interact with the things that they want in life, and they're usually going to be very competitive. Now, this is the opposite of what we see with the INFJ, who is the most feminine personality type, as we discussed earlier. And the thing that is shared between these two types is that because they exist on the ends of the masculine and feminine spectrum, when they engage in behaviors or kind of ways of processing information that go against their natural form, it usually stands out compared to their normal personality. So when an ESTJ engages in more feminine behaviors, it's usually very contrast to how they usually act. The same with INFJs and masculine behavior. And this is one of the interesting things when we look at these two types in particular, this is because they exist on the two ends of this one masculine and feminine spectrum. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on the masculinity and femininity of the cognitive functions and which types are the most masculine and feminine. Remember, everything I talked about in this video is just a theory of mine. I don't consider any of this fact, and I don't think that you should either. It is something that I think is interesting, though, and has some relatively useful applications in terms of how we think about certain personality types. Let me know what you thought about this video down in the comment section below. Feel free to let me know if you think I'm crazy or you think this is all wrong. As I mentioned, this is just kind of a theory I've been working on for a few months. I'm not even that super attached to it. I just think it's interesting. Other than that, I would like to remind people that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.